counting up now to give Cecil a little bit of something to trim off for the show. How's everybody doing out there? Love y'all. Happy to be joined by you today, everybody. Let's go live. What is Urban Meyer doing with Travis Etienne? And should we care? That and more this week on the couch. Time to circle back with Matt Waldman. Matt, lots of chatter about Travis Etienne. Are you tuning in, tuning out? Do you think it's important? Does it matter?
I think right now you got to take it in stages. I think there's the first stage is that you look at Urban Meyer, and as we talked about on our draft show, is he the next Steve Spurrier, or will he not spiral into that Lou Holtz, Steve Spurrier, I'm a great recruiter, good college football coach, but out of my depth in the NFL? We have yet to determine that. There are warning signs that it's possible, so you have to kind of keep that on the low setting there and see if it starts to boil. And then when you, on the other hand, you look at Etienne within that picture, and this is a back who he has flaws. You know, he's a great speedster. He has some functional power, meaning that he can break arm tackles and he can run tough, but he's not a tackle breaker. And then he's more, a lot of these backs who are like Reggie Bush physical types, in terms of what they, speed, acceleration, movement, and that 205 to 215 pound range. A lot of these backs who are highly athletic, they have that whole corner store mentality early on in their careers, and sometimes even when they've shown that they've improved over the course of their time in college, they're the most likely to revert back to that once they make the initial transition to the NFL, because they're trying to make a big play. They feel like they're counted on to do that, and maybe they're going to be used less often. So as a result of that, they even feel more pressure against these tougher defenses that they were drafted to be like, kind of like Vinny the Microwave Johnson, where they come in and they've got to like make the big play and score a lot of points or get a lot of yards in a short period of time. And then because they're going to get put back on the bench, and not given that time to kind of breathe and establish certain things that other large count backs do. So you take all of that, and then you add the fact that they're using them at wide receiver right now when they have three really good wide receivers on this team and some promising prospects that we could talk about later who are not even like, who are terrific athletes and good pass catchers themselves. And you're thinking, well, they drafted, and then, Urban Meyer saying, I drafted a scat back in the first round. Right. So then we start thinking about Sean McVay and Dunbar, and we start thinking about those types of fits. And I think where we have to look at this is that if you draft Travis Etienne and you think that he's going to be the lead back in Jacksonville, then you were already deluded for this year. If you're expecting that for 2021. So the bigger question becomes, what's his long-term outlook? And so if you drafted him with the idea that he's going to eventually displace James Robinson, Robinson's on a multi-year contract still, cheap, and maybe he'll demand more money at some point, but being a UDFA, he's not going to have that much leverage unless he has two amazing back-to-back seasons. And even at that point, He's going to be old enough that it won't matter. It'll be the Le'Veon Bell effect. So, it's a tough situation. He's not a guy I'm drafting at all unless he falls to me like in the second, late second round, and that's never happened.
No.
And it won't ever happen.
It's fascinating because, like you said, the background of all this is we're evaluating Urban Meyer. We're trying to get a handle on Urban Meyer. And Urban Meyer casts a shadow over everybody, and Trevor Lawrence included, everybody in Jacksonville, And what's fascinating about this is that there are signs that Urban Meyer, number one, is just going to do what he did in college in the pros, right? Albert Breer comes out in his Monday Morning Quarterback this week and says, I don't think this is just an experiment. Okay. Urban Meyer says we're primarily teaching Etienne the wide receiver position and the offense from wide receiver. This wasn't just, Trevor Lawrence can't make handoffs and we're messing around. Okay. And then, of course, when Breer brought that up, he said Percy Harvin, Curtis Samuel, even Chris Brown, Smart Football, said, hey, yeah, I don't want to put words in Chris's mouth. Chris is fantastic.
Sure.
But he also brought up the H-back position. It's a specific position in
Urban
Meyer's
loves.
offense.
Yeah.
And the other piece of the puzzle here, Matt, is that Urban was heartbroken. That's the word that was used to miss out on Kadarius Toney. And if you piece this all together, it sure looks like, number one, he's trying to reproduce his offenses from college. Number two, he couldn't get Toney, so he saw the potential of Etienne to be a player like Toney. Now, John Shipley, who's awesome, and I always trust John, is saying, hey, look, this doesn't mean that they're not going to use him as a tailback. This doesn't mean that he's not going to be a running back. It's just something they're doing to add his potential value to the offense. And so I think that's the glass half full take. And certainly for fantasy, if Etienne becomes like an Austin Eckler kind of player with 100 or 150 carries, James Robinson getting all the dirty work, but then Etienne's catching like 70 balls, we're talking right away. So for fantasy, this will be good, but this is still something he has to take to. This is something he has to actually be successful. Go ahead.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Every time any teams used Curtis Samuel the way, you think of Curtis Samuel, Percy Harvin, Cordero Patterson, Tavon Austin, Hester, Ted Ginn. I'm trying to all these players that have been are going to be these players. You know who the best player was at all of this? Randall Cobb back in Green Bay's day, and they didn't use him like this. And I think that unless Urban Meyer is going to find the secret formula and say, listen, this is what I did in college, and I'm going to show you how it's supposed to be done in the NFL, whereas these other guys were never doing it well. Unless that's the dynamic and he proves that, I don't believe it. I just don't believe that Etienne's going to be he'll be used that way, but I don't think he's going to be productive that way.
Right.
And because I think it's just that whole usage thing. There's got to be a level of commitment to it that I think Urban Meyer would like to have, but I don't know if his offensive coordinator is going to have. I don't know if the team's going to actually have that on that level. And I don't know if Urban Meyer is going to give that level of pushback to say, I'd rather go down with this, than to keep my job in my first or second year. And, because this could be a real disaster for him if this doesn't, offensively, this doesn't work out. Especially, I could just see, this is one of those situations I could see where Meyer just, he basically flushes his NFL career down the toilet within, 10 to 12 weeks. And somebody else comes in and just runs a regular NFL offense, or with some of the things that we see in the league a lot. And suddenly this offense looks really good, compared to whatever Urban Meyer was doing. And so I get the idea that Etienne will be used as at least a complement in the backfield. I absolutely agree with that. And that's why I'd still take him. I'd still draft him if I could get him, because I think he has some potential value there. And if he matures fast enough, maybe as a runner, maybe he can provide enough competition for James Robinson that even if the political decision is we're going to force feed Etienne the ball, even though everyone knows Robinson's the better back right now, and he plays well enough, then it won't matter. It'll just be analysts nitpicking the fact that they like James Robinson more, but the production doesn't, the production really says it doesn't make that much of a difference to us. But it is really a fascinating story. And I just think there's too many moving parts with it to want to take a chance in the first round of rookie drafts on a guy like that.
Well, that's the whole thing, right? It's moving parts. Usually when a player is taken in the first round, We aren't guessing at how their transition to the NFL is going to go. That's what makes them a first rounder. And it's time to stop talking ourselves out of this being something that's just coach speak. This is a plan. Josh Waters in the chat room says Darrell Bevell was the OC when Percy Harvin was in Minnesota. I mean, they're telling us what they're going to do. Let's stop trying to say, no, they're going to do something different than what they're saying.
And then the first thing that I think is, okay, who overruled taking Rondale Moore? Who overruled taking Elijah Moore? Who overruled taking some of these other guys who actually have done a lot of this type of work and are better route runners and better receivers than Travis Etienne, and arguably better runners in the open field? I would argue that, Rondale Moore, at least, unless they were just concerned about injury. I mean, to me, Rondale Moore is one of the best fits that that's from this rookie class right now. I mean, like, this is a guy that I've pretty much leapfrogged him over a number of players now, because there was a big block where they're all kind of ranked the same pre-draft, and then spreading the field where they could put AJ or what's his face, the Texas A&M kid,
Christian Kirk.
Yeah, Kirk. Inside. Either one of those guys could be inside opposite Rondale Moore on the inside with 4 receiver sets. And you're going to tell me that, like, I mean, I know people were like, well, it didn't work with Andy Isabella, but, the Rondale Moore is like miles ahead of Andy Isabella as a route runner. And I would even argue as a pass catcher. So to me, the fact that they were like, well, I didn't get Tony. So that tells me he was connected to 2 programs, Florida and Ohio State. And as our buddy Eric Stoner observed to me during draft day, he texted me and said, Urban Meyer, and he's a Jags fan, Urban Meyer's regime is just picking top 100 athletes from high school, from like the prep ranks. Yeah. Like, he's literally like, he goes, that's what it looks like. And maybe there's more of a plan to all of this, but the predominating factor is that he's still looking at Tom Lemming, I guess. I don't know. I mean, and maybe that's his main scouting source at this point. And I'm kidding, but there's a little bit of truth to that joke.
Yes. And we'll watch this. You mentioned Rondale Moore, and again, they had to pick 33 and 45. Yeah. So they had a reasonable, if they wanted that player, the H-back, it was staring in the face with Rondale Moore, who already has exhibited these things. You don't have to coach him up or convert him. So that's interesting. Like you said, it may be the injury.
And Laviska Shenault.
I mean, now John Shipley would say he's an outside receiver. He can be an outside receiver. They see him as an outside receiver. So that's okay. This isn't a question of Laviska Shenault's prime years going by the wayside, in the same way that with James Robinson, where he may get the Philip Lindsay treatment. Oh man, our undrafted rookie went for 1,000 yards. That's really inconvenient because we want to have somebody that we picked, but again, what makes this all so fascinating is we're interpreting all this in the background of how's Urban Meyer going to do as a coach? Is this going to be the Jags are no longer laughing stocks, or is it another chapter in the Jags becoming laughing stocks? But you mentioned Rondale Moore, so let's shift gears. And again, RSP folks, if you haven't gotten it, still not too late. If you're in a dynasty league, it's everything you need. And you do the post-draft RSP, because now we get used to these guys as somewhat formless in terms of we know what they're capable of. We know their hot zones and cold zones and things like that. But when they get drafted, and most specifically, it's the coach, the scheme, the position, ancillary information we get, like when they talk about them in the press conferences, what do you plan on doing with them? But also fit, because the problem is, like we're talking about with Etienne, sometimes teams have a plan for a player that isn't necessarily the most wise, well-intentioned. I mean, the intentions are there, well-informed. So that can sometimes affect how we look at a player. Of course, in football, there is no such thing as an individual accomplishment or an individual, detriment. Everything is in the context of a team. So the players change. They pull down from the formless void into a reality of this player, and also we learned things about like the draft capital spent on them, all kinds of good things. So it sounds like Rondale Moore is a player that you felt like was helped by his landing spot. Give me another name that whenever you saw when and where he went in the draft, it made you more interested in him.
Well, it's hard to say that I was more interested than I was in Kyle Pitts and Jamar Chase. But certainly those two landing spots were just primo. I mean, and Chase getting reunited with Burrow, the whole too many mouths to feed also just it's like the same CeeDee Lamb, same argument we made with CeeDee Lamb last year. It's like whenever I hear fantasy analysts say too many mouths to feed to a combination like that, I just smile and just make sure that I raise that guy even higher on my draft board, or maybe even lower him a couple of ticks to make sure, but star him to know I'm getting the value. And a guy who was curious to me was Rashad Bateman, because the first, when we first were on the show, I was like, oh, I hate that pick, but now I actually like it. And I think the reason is that Bateman is such a good route runner breaking inside in the middle of the field, and he's very good at adjusting on the fly, off script. And so those are the two biggest strengths about Lamar Jackson's game, is throwing in the middle of the field, and being able to, work off script, or hang last second in the pocket and make the tight window throw. And then, on the perimeter, be able to just, also be able to throw the ball with more of those high arcing air under the ball type of passes. And Bateman's good at all that stuff. And when you look at the receivers they have, Marquise Brown isn't good over the middle. I thought he might be good over the middle. It was there was potential for that to be the case. It hasn't been realized. Miles Boykin to me would be great in Atlanta. Where Matt Ryan is used to throwing, timing perimeter routes with velocity. That's his best thing, is that like that 15 to 30 yards, the outs, the comebacks, the curls, and none of those routes are a part of what Lamar Jackson does well. So then you have Duvernay, who's kind of a straight line outside guy, and I don't think they fully utilized him yet. We'll see what happens there. But there's nobody who really the best option for Lamar Jackson has been Mark Andrews.
Right.
And so now you get a guy who's basically a quicker, more dynamic complement to Mark Andrews, who ties all the things together that these other receivers can do and more. And so I love Bateman in that spot now, and I think that he's kind of a polarizing option that helped him. Michael Carter. I'm a big Michael Carter fan, and I just think that, it's like he's going to get to be Devonta Freeman to Tevin Coleman's Tevin Coleman, or maybe even Tevin Coleman's aging Tevin Coleman.
Right.
And while that offensive line isn't great, he's such a good receiver. I think he's one of the better receivers at the running back position that I've seen in a long time, and it's up there with Clyde Edwards-Helaire because of his route running. Like, he's just got a really good feel for finding that secondary spot in the zone, and doing it so quickly. And I like him as a runner better than Edwards-Helaire. And I think Edwards-Helaire is a very good back and a very good fantasy back. And he's going to have a nice jump this year in Kansas City. But Carter is a guy that I think that left side of the offensive line is going to be good enough that he'll be able to do some decent work. I loved Sermon's landing, obviously. Everyone knows that. I just think that, everyone's a lot, again, just like the same people who are like too many mouths to feed with great receivers. When I hear people say, well, they have a committee backfield, they always run a committee backfield. It's like they've already said like a million times, the only reason we've done that is due to injuries. And when you look at the players who they've stuck into that backfield, when it's their turn to get the ball, they're basically the full-time back. It's like a serial monogamous for I mean, really what happens is that everyone gets hurt when they bring somebody in that is going to replace him, then they get the bulk of the carries. So what they're looking for is someone who can carry most of the load, and they just happen to pick good enough backs and also have a great offensive line. So Sermon to me is just, people are missing on numerous levels, and some of it is a combination of not understanding what makes a good running back. Some of it is not understanding what makes a good running back and then doubling down because now that they see, and talking about the committee thing, because that's something that they're reaching for to make an argument with, as opposed to like really analyzing this a little bit deeper. Trey Lance, we've talked about is a great fit. I mean, he's an unbelievable fit. And I certainly like that. I have some ones that are more mixed bag that I think are interesting. Like Jamar Jefferson. I don't think he's a great back, but I certainly think that he could become a starter in this league. I think he has enough talent to get there. And while the two names ahead of him and Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift seem locked in, the fact they were able to get rid of they needed a little excuse to get rid of Kerryon Johnson after his injury plagued beginning. But Swift to me was very productive, but he picked up a lot of bad habits year one. So I'm looking to see if he overcomes some of those. And they do have such a good offensive line that, as we see with running backs, if a guy comes in and does really well with what the scheme asks him to do, and he performs at a high level, well, he's the only back on that team that I think has he has the best speed of the backs on that team. Like we know Williams isn't a speedster. Swift has weird speed acceleration kind of combo. He's quick, but he needs a long runway. Jamar Jefferson doesn't need as long of a runway, I don't think. And I think he's a little bit more powerful than Swift is. So if he gets in there and they run that toss and that outside zone, which he does really well, it might make it tough for them to he could really clog up the works there. Amari Rodgers, everyone's down on him. Everyone's down on him because he's going to be stuck with Jordan Love. That's the whole fear. Right. I know that's exactly what it is. And it's also because he's not as exciting as Rondale Moore and maybe Elijah Moore. I think he's a better runner than Elijah Moore is. As much as I like Elijah Moore's running, I also think he's a terrific contested catch receiver. I've seen a number of plays where he did a great job of that, even as an outside receiver. And as dumb as this whole thing may feel to fans about Rodgers and them picking Love, I have to think that if there's people inside the organization, coaches leaking out to the media, Love's not remotely ready.
Right.
The whole works of this is like, we need a quarterback in the trade.
Right.
So if whether it's Teddy Bridgewater and in Denver, or Derek Carr, or Baker Mayfield, or I guess I'm just praying on that one. But all those, whatever it is, Ben Roethlisberger, that would be hilarious. Ben Roethlisberger going to Green Bay. I don't know how Steelers fans. I think Steelers fans would love it, but they'd be kind of sick to their stomach at the same time. But something like that, they're going to get a decent enough quarterback who's going to be able to throw the ball to Amari Rodgers. And if they don't, well, Chad Kelly, who I'm contractually obligated to mention on every podcast episode that I'm ever on, is made the team, at least right now. He's in the mini camp. They didn't just send him packing after the tryout. And that's a guy that will throw people open and has no compunction about he's not the economist that Alex Smith is. He will, when it's open, he doesn't have to do a scientific test to see whether or not that was really open before he throws the ball. I mean, so I like Rodgers, and I think that maybe it's an assumption of rational personnel decision making. But even if it isn't, who's going to be most likely to get checkdowns on this team? The running backs, the slot receiver, and the tight end. And I just think that Rodgers' value will hold up a little bit better than people think. Jacob Harris with the Rams is the last one I'll mention, because I hate that the Rams mentioned him as a wide receiver / tight end, because if they force him to put his hand in the ground and add weight, I think they've basically set him back about 5 years. Because look at Logan Thomas, maybe, as an example of that. But this dude's a wide receiver, and he's fast enough to be a wide receiver. And we know that Matthew Stafford has no problem throwing to big men, and knows how to do that. And the one thing Jacob Harris does really well is the Calvin Johnson imitation on the boundary and in the red zone, So let him be that until he can figure out how to be the rest of a receiver, and get some value out of him that way instead, and maybe they call him a tight end and it's just the glorified Jimmy Graham thing. And if they do that, that's fine. But I just don't think they need to fatten him up to get him on the field. Let him be what he is right now and get some use out of him. Otherwise, Sean McVay is one of those guys that I feel like I'm like this in terms of how I feel about him from week to week. Like there's a lot I respect about what he's done. And then there's things that I'm going, is this the move that's ultimately going to lead him down the road of getting canned? Right. And I feel like there's like 3 or 4 like that I'm waiting to see how they unfold.
Yes. He knows exactly what he wants. I don't know if it's good for Sean McVay to get exactly what he wants, though. And, well, you can go back to Gerald Everett, right? The very first pick of the Sean McVay regime. Surprise, the Rams didn't have a first-round pick, was Gerald Everett in the second round. And what exactly did they get out of him that tilted the field in their direction? Now, granted, if you look at the rest of the second round, it's actually a pretty rough second round. That year, Taylor Moton is a pretty good. Taylor Moton and Deion Dawkins at the end of the second round, probably the best picks. Juju, of course. So it isn't like he passed. In the middle of the second round, you're not passing on players that everybody had tabbed as long-term starters, etc. But he has this role in his offense for this receiving tight end. But absolutely, when Jacob Harris was announced as a tight end, and that was their plan, then it absolutely, on the fantasy level, created intrigue in dynasty leagues. I want to touch on some other players you brought up real quick and just add in my 2 cents. Bateman. And I have no problem with Bateman as a player, and I have no problem with Bateman, like you said, with some time to reflect on how he can help the Ravens. I still think, unless we're going to see Greg Roman really turn over a new leaf, and all of a sudden this offense has 100 or 150 more pass attempts, it's just a numbers game. It's just a numbers game where unless you have Marquise Brown or Mark Andrews just falling off the map, how do the numbers happen for Bateman to be relevant? Now, Bateman could still be a hit where you take him in your dynasty rookie draft because you just wait, but he asserts himself early on, even in that up and down limited volume role that every pass catcher with the Ravens is going to have. So you've got something good when eventually his volume, maybe like year 3.
And I think Brown falls off the map, to be honest, because I just don't think he's a real player anymore. I think he's a great vertical receiver, but that's it. Right.
And that's not the hot zone for Lamar Jackson. It just didn't work out. Carter, I think, while I like Carter, I see like Duke Johnson when I see Carter. And I know that you and I can go back to Amir Abdullah and Duke Johnson and say, pound the table and say, these guys can be every down backs. And unfortunately, when they get to the NFL says, well, maybe not. And we'll see how Carter fits. The good thing that Carter has is, like you said, that Kyle Shanahan running game and Devontae Freeman, and how Carter could fit in that fashion. And he doesn't really have any stiff competition. I think Josh Adams is actually probably the best competition he has running the ball in that backfield right now. The problem with Carter in your rookie draft, and maybe even in your best ball drafts, is that his opportunity is greatly increasing his cost. To the point where, and this look, by the way, this is a weak year for rookie drafts. Okay, unless you're in a super flex league. In a super flex league, the first round is fantastic. In typical 1 quarterback leagues, you're going to find that you don't like late first round, early second round picks as much as you like them the last few years, partially because those wide receiver classes were so good the last few years. And when you get to the third round, you're just rolling the dice. That's why you like somebody like Jacob Harris when you get there, or Amari Rodgers buying on the Aaron Rodgers discount. And you've already brought up Randall Cobb. He's a Randall Cobb kind of player. Jefferson's interesting as soon as Kerryon Johnson was released. And you're right to bring up the Lions offensive line. You're moving in Halapuli Vati Vaitai inside to guard, where he can just be a road grader, a $10 million a year road grader. But that's okay because he's in between two very, very good players.
At least they have the brains to do that.
Yeah. Well, Brad Holmes is coming in, and it's great that Brad Holmes has a plan. Okay. And I see how these players fit into the plan. Trey Sermon, and folks, if you are listening to the show, watching this show, you probably already knew that Trey Sermon was a player that the RSP really liked. And yeah, when Kyle Shanahan trades up in a draft, he doesn't have many picks to get Trey Sermon. Yeah, you like this. You like this a lot. And Raheem Mostert, Jeff Wilson, not under contract. Trey Lance, we've talked about this extensively. It's a dream combo. It's a dream combo. It's a dream, really. And let your imagination go in fantasy of where this could go. Again, go back to Robert Griffin III when the one good year that he was healthy and had nobody in the passing game to work with. So all good names. Okay, let's go the other direction. Give me a name that after the draft you were less excited, other than obviously Travis Etienne. I mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but let's leave that discussion aside. Is there anybody else you can think of that after the draft, whether because they fell in the draft or the fit or otherwise, just the way you look at them now changed?
DeVonta Smith. It could be fine over time, but I'm not sold on Jalen Hurts yet.
Nope.
And so until I'm sold on their quarterback, I'm not sold on DeVonta Smith because I don't think, Jalen Reagor is a rugged player. Jalen Reagor was misused, though. And the way he was used is the way that I think DeVonta Smith is going to wind up being used. And he's not as rugged as Jalen Reagor is. Mm-hmm. So I think he's a terrific talent, but I don't like the fit. So the cost is just not worth it to me right now. He's a guy that I think maybe after year one, you might be able to get him at a discount. So that's where I would rather be. Tylan Wallace in Baltimore. I love Tylan Wallace, the player. Hate that situation for him because what he does best are the things that Lamar Jackson does worst. So it's like Miles Boykin all over again, but a different looking player. Didn't love the Racey McMath pick, who, in Tennessee. I liked Racey McMath, the player, and he was one of those guys that I didn't have rated highly. But like Jacob Harris, I kind of noted to people in the RSP, don't look at where he's ranked, look at the score and understand that this is a guy that is on his way to developing into at least a contributor in the NFL. Like they have that potential. And depending on where they go, their development promise could be really strong. But with Des Fitzpatrick being added in there, and then you already have, Josh Reynolds, who can play inside and outside for them, and they run the ball a lot as they do. It's pretty packed right now, unless McMath plays well enough early on that they're like, this Reynolds guy, we don't need more than this 1 year, so we're not going to re-sign him after that. And that could happen. But even then, he's probably going to be third in the pecking order. And so it's not, you can, there are guys, you could probably pick him up late in a deep draft and still feel okay about it and sit on him as a practice squad guy. But there's other compelling options. Don't like Brevin Jordan in Houston.
No.
It's just like, I just don't like anybody in Houston.
Well, exactly.
Nobody can.
Exactly.
You can't. It's the best guy you can like is Davis Mills, just as like he's going to get the opportunity to probably play now. And if he survives and shows some leadership, it could be really promising for him. But Jordan in itself, I mean, Houston's been kind of the place where tight ends go to die.
Right. It's a revolving door.
Yeah. So those are ones that I'm really not a huge fan of, right off the bat. And then I think that I believe there's, let's see, look at one more. Let me look at my little cheat sheet here and see if there's anybody that really just kind of, a fit. I'll say that, a fit that I really don't I don't like the Chuba Hubbard fit all that much.
Right.
I like, behind Christian McCaffrey, fine, but they're a diverse running attack. The reason that Mike Davis did decently with a bad O line, and the reason that McCaffrey is unbelievable, is that they run a very diverse ground game. There's a combination of different types of zone looks and gap looks that they do, and you have to be a really refined decision maker and student of the game. And Chuba Hubbard, to me, I mean, he's not Forrest Gump, but the way that they played him, it's kind of like just run, Forrest, run.
Right.
And the way that they had him play, and the way that his body alignment is as a runner. Any running back that cannot that has a 7 to 10 yard head start running downhill and falls backwards when they collide with a flat-footed safety or a small linebacker, that's a bad sign. It was a bad sign for Darren McFadden. It was a bad sign for Bishop Sankey. It was a bad sign for a number of backs. And I just think that Hubbard's one of those guys that's not a great fit. And then I guess, if I was going to me, in terms of another, just really bad fit, let me see if there's one that's, I just think I hate the fits right now temporarily. I hate the fits for the Jaguars receivers with Etienne there, because I really like Jalen Camp. I think Josh Imatorbhebhe is intriguing, and I think both those players might wind up on different squads, and it will be among the reasons that fans are calling for Urban Meyer's head, because what will happen is that Chark will leave after the end of his contract and probably wind up somewhere else. Jones is older, so it's like the end is near at some point for a good player. And what they have left is Laviska Shenault. So what do they have after that? Well, if they're smart, hopefully it's Camp. If Camp can show what, I think he's going to be able to show. And Imatorbhebhe, to me, is very intriguing. And if one or both those guys leave and do a Taylor Gabriel out of Cleveland, or a Willie Snead, or even, and I would say they'll do way more than that. That will be the death knell, especially when they're like, we don't have any weapons for Trevor Lawrence other than a guy who can't take handoffs and who we're using as an H-back. And, Chris Manhertz, Luke Farrell,
Right.
I mean, oh my God, if that happens, it'll be over for Urban pretty quickly. But those are kind of my fears, but I wouldn't give up hope on either of those players, because as late as they can go, I think that they can be, valuable to you, down the line as practice squad stashes.
Yeah, there's so many layers to this when we try to say, good or bad landing spots. And some of what you're touching on is just the simplest and easiest layer. Is it a good organization or a bad organization? This is maybe one of the better arguments for Rashad Bateman, right? Just, is it the kind of organization that generally gets the most out of their players, develops them well? It's an environment that helps players hit their top range of outcomes. We can talk about the role, we can talk about the system, we can talk about the coach. And but with Houston players, guys like Brevin Jordan and Nico Collins, at least Nico Collins, opportunity. That's another thing people are going to say, well, that landing spot based on opportunity. But I think a lot of times we look back and we overrate players based on early opportunity and underrate players because they don't have immediate opportunity. So there's a lot of things to sift through there. And one of the things that you brought up the name Jalen Camp. And I want to know, because this reminds me a little bit Matt, of the draft where we had like Alan Lazard and Auden Tate and Marcel Aitman. Remember all these the previous archetype receivers, they all fell. And this year, it wasn't like they fell because I don't think a lot of them were that highly regarded. But again, you have even the Charleston guy, Mike Strawn, interesting. Marion Terry in Seattle, Seth Williams fell to Denver. I think when we get to the third and fourth round of rookie drafts, a lot of people will be shrugging their shoulders and not quite sure what to do. I'll tell you what to do after we finish this take. But other than this one player that I'll bring up, is there anybody other than Jalen Camp, or you just want to use the time to stump for Camp a little bit more, out of all these intriguing size, speed guys who fell to the end or even out of the draft?
Sure. And I think all the guys you mentioned, other than Seth Williams, don't fit in the same category as Camp, because Tamorrion Terry is slow in terms of right off the line. He has horrible acceleration, and he doesn't do a great job of catching the ball in ways that he should. So he's an inconsistent player and not athletically meeting the standards of what the NFL looks for in an outside receiver. The rest of the players you mentioned also have their issues from that regard. Seth Williams is a guy that, as I've said, if the light comes on for him, the entire body of work will be like a 4th of July display. I mean, he's got that kind of promise. But the thing about Camp, and then I'll add a couple other guys in here to that mix. The thing about Camp is that he played in a triple option offense, and so a lot of people don't see the production with him. But so when people say I studied the player, well, they probably studied the production. They didn't study the film. When you study the film of Jalen Camp, he might have the best ball tracking, catch radius, and aerial acrobatics of any receiver in this class. Maybe of the past 3 to 4, to be quite honest. What he needs to learn how to do is break, like run hard breaks. That's basically it. He played inside a lot too. They used him inside a lot, and he's fast as all get out. So he's the athlete that a lot of these other players aren't. The guy that I would add that is interesting to me, or there's two that are really interesting to me. One is Jonathan Adams out of Detroit, who I just think he has a fantastic catch radius. And again, like Camp, has the promise to be able to flexibility to bend and run the routes. It's just a matter of learning how to do it. So I think he gives you, at least Travis Fulgham plus potential from a UDFA spot. And a guy who you won't even need to draft him, but you can pick him up in a lot of leagues. I won't be able to after I say this, but
good.
TJ Vasher. TJ Vasher is kind of like a Justin Hunter-like player in the best of what Hunter did, but I didn't see the worst. And I think that he's one of those guys that in Dallas, I know that everybody likes, they're like in Simi Fehoko and, but TJ Vasher to me fascinates me. I think he and Camp had the two most impressive abilities to win the ball at the catch point, and both of them showed promise in ways that can make them more complete players. And I think people are, really, they're kind of sleeping on them. Whereas a lot of these guys that are more meh to folks, there's reason for that. That's because they were high on them early and they didn't really know how to study them, like the Tamorrion Terry thing. That was just easy after a while because you realize it's like, oh, he faced tight man coverage, he can't win. Why is that? And then you get your answer pretty quickly.
Yeah, the layers here are good too because we have two sides of this. One is the player himself, and the other is the potential opportunity. That's why I'm glad you brought up Vasher and Fehoko, who they took in the 5th round. And looming in the background here is that Michael Gallup's a free agent next year. So whoever it is, this is where we get to when Cease and I do the preseason watch list. And first of all, I want to say, if you're listening and following along, you're our kind of people, because and there'll probably be a lot of late round guys that we don't touch on, but please shoot us questions and things like that. help us spread our esoteric knowledge here. You mentioned, by the way, I want to mention, speaking along that same line, you mentioned Travis Fulgham, who initially came to prominence with an old regime. Now it's a new regime. That's another thing we need to think about. New regime, clean slate for Fulgham. However, I think we can say at this point, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside is not going to be it. There's a big opening in that wide receiver core, and maybe it's Trevon Grimes, who I think the quarterback coach was with him at UCLA, on Nick Sirianni's staff. Anyway, Grimes is interesting, again, because we're looking at the player, but we're also looking at the potential opportunity. You mentioned Adams. That's going to be an interesting one to watch, because what do they even have outside other than Quintez Cephas if we're looking a year or two down the line? And they also signed, I think it was Javon McKinley from Notre Dame. So they have two big receivers there that they go ahead.
And it just frustrates me because I know that he didn't do anything in Arizona, but Fran Duffy said he flashed in Carolina in practices. But the Eagles don't know what they have sitting at the bottom of their tight end chart. And they really didn't need to draft a wide receiver, if you ask me. They have
Hakeem
one.
Butler.
Yeah. I know a lot of people see that as I'm even like, you talk to Evan Silva, you talk to Greg, all these different people who say that they missed on him as well. And I'm a believer, and this is a very important kind of esoteric point that I'm about to release on a podcast with Dwayne McFarland, is about organically letting things be. We're in such a hurry to evaluate, but sometimes in order to evaluate, you need to let time pass. You need to let certain things happen. We haven't seen anything happen with Hakeem Butler. So the absence of him on the field has created the conclusion that he can't play. In the same way that the absence of him on the field probably created the conclusion that Raheem Mostert couldn't play. It's the same thing, but people look at it from different perspective now that they have the opportunity of hindsight. I just think that from what Duffy said, the Eagles don't know what they have in him either. They don't know. They're just seeing him as a guy they added late who they could possibly use his size to add to do something a little bit more with. And every player you mentioned, I would take Hakeem Butler over all of them.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Seth Williams. We talked about Seth Williams too, and Williams kind of reminds me of Butler in so much. I mean, and there's stylistic comparisons too.
Sure,
but in so much that we know what matters or what can tilt the field on plays, especially at that outside receiver position. And Williams has it. Butler had it. However, this goes back to your, it's a piece almost like in the syllabus, like you read it before the class starts, that great emotional divide, that there's often things as we are rating ourselves or rating the teams or trying to project these players, that there's sometimes things that are out of view that sometimes warranted, sometimes unwarranted, keep players from getting opportunities. And it just makes you wonder. The last one I want to mention too, and this just all gets into why we're watching in OTAs, rookie mini camps, and then we're going to be watching in camp, whatever we have, whoever we draft in the late rounds of our rookie drafts, or whatever we've wheeled and dealed to get our next generation of talent in our fantasy teams, or just watching the teams around the league, watching players, and we just enjoy watching player development. We start letting those perceptions be altered. Like I had said on Twitter like a couple of days ago, as rookie mini camps were mostly opening this weekend around the league, this is the first little drip of players are either going to be a lot better or a lot worse than we thought. And maybe they aren't always open about it, but some teams can see at the rookie mini camp, oh boy, this is going to be good. Like Jarrett Patterson. I think Ron Rivera already loves Patterson. That's like his kind of guy, right? But then also teams see right away, whoops. They'll see right away, oh, this isn't really going to work out is the way we'd hoped, even from that little piece of information, but it'll continue to be supplemented by OTAs and then camp. And then we can watch all these battles among the later round drafted players or the UDFAs. Another one I'll bring up, you brought up Terry, Cade Johnson, who I think
I think Cade Johnson and Connor Weddington, they're both players I compared to Doug Baldwin pre-draft. They both wound up in Seattle. And while we know that Dwayne Eskridge is going to get his shot to be the movable piece, along he and Tyler Lockett will probably interchange inside outside, and that's how they view his fit. those two other guys are ones you might want to watch down the line. They're interesting players in that regard for sure. I like that you mentioned Johnson.
And who gets that spot? Maybe there'll be one spot, maybe two spots. It's not the greatest. Penny Hart is still there, but not the greatest depth chart after those top three. And he gets to be paired up with Russell Wilson, at least for the time being. Really quick before we go off the rails, I got to mention my guy. And this wasn't a guy that I meant to be my guy. Even when he was drafted in the 4th round, I didn't think Kylan Granson was going to be the player that I was scrambling to make sure I got every
look at you.
But at some point, we can't ignore all these signs. Frank Reich basically pounded on the table for him. He's so far impressing everybody around him. He is in an offense that highlights the tight end, and he has a quarterback that likes to throw to the tight end. Am I missing anything here? Kylan Granson's often going undrafted in rookie drafts. I think he should be a 3rd round pick, maybe even a late 2nd round pick.
In a 1.5 PPR draft, I would agree with you. In a normal PPR circumstance, I would say let's see how well he thinks on his feet. Mm-hmm. I would rather see him. The fact that you can get him as a 4th or 5th round pick easily is enough anyway. But I don't see. Maybe that's a little high for me, but I get it. Like, I mean, I compared him to Trey Burton pre-draft, so obviously the Colts saw the same thing, you know. So I mean, it's not like, you know, and Burton, the biggest issue with him wasn't his play on the field, was his ability to stay healthy, and that's where I think he's pretty much they just feel like that isn't there for him. Another guy like Zach Davidson, I think.
Sure,
I think
Zach he can punt too.
Yep, he can, but he might be able to give you a little bit of that Adam Troutman. He might not be able to be as quick to acclimate. I think Troutman's going to be a fine player in the league. But I think Davidson has that potential to develop along those lines. As you know, when we start looking down the line, and you can get him as a free agent right now in a lot of leagues. In 1.5, I'll hold on to him for a year or two and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I mentioned the punter thing kind of jokingly, but hey, anything you can do to make the roster, like that's another reason I like Jalen Camp. I think he's a 4-phase special teams contributor. So anything you can do to get that, it's like Tom Brady, right? I mean, just hanging on the roster for that first year, and then maybe opportunity will come and you can show what you can do. But if you don't contribute on special teams, if you can't make a significant contribution, then it's more difficult to get that opportunity. So we'll see. So much more to come. This sets the stage, sets the tone, but there's so much more to come. Okay, last like 7 minutes off the rails real quick, and we can go anywhere with this. But I'll just ask you this because I feel like we're similar, Matt, simpatico in a lot of ways with our tortured metaphors and things like that, often coming from all the different culture that we have absorbed. And we've talked a lot about music, and we could do music, which we should eventually. But I know you bring up films. I remember how you used Jaws so well. Tell me a film that has influenced you, that is at least a little part in the person that you've become today.
Wow.
Doesn't have to be just one.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of movies that probably were that way. I mean, certainly I really liked $1 Million Baby. I think that
what's like the 50 words or less takeaway for you from this?
Yeah, well, it's just, for me, there's something to be said about grit and believing in yourself. And I think that really, you know, the main character of that movie is, you know, to me, an unbelievably strong warrior, and someone who I just have a lot of admiration for that character. You know, and so I really loved that movie. I liked it's weird because the movie gets panned a lot because it won an Oscar over The Color Purple, and and I can understand why a lot of people look at it and say typical Hollywood BS kind of thing. But I like the story out of Africa. And I like Robert Redford's character, and I liked the way that he was always learning and kind of a free spirit. And I've always kind of admired that type of character in terms of, not looking at people in a way where he was a very functional human being in a very dysfunctional world. But knew that and was okay with living without, if it meant that the dysfunctional things around him were going to try and pin him down. So I really kind of liked that about his character. Jaws had a big impact on me for sure. But I think, I don't know if, Lilo and Stitch. I'd say I really like the notion of the notion that blood isn't family and family isn't necessarily blood.
Yeah.
And there's other movies like that, but that one at its core does a really good job of outlining that in a simple way. And maybe even a more complex way than you would imagine. And
sure,
but it's a fun movie, and I certainly enjoy that. God, there's tons that I could imagine, but those come to mind right off the bat.
No, it's a good listen. I like the way each one highlights like different parts of your personality or different things that matter to you or valued. And I love that you put an animated film in. These can be films with gravity, films that stay with you. Have you seen Soul yet?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. It's great.
Yeah, it was a great movie. Great. Absolutely.
It handled some very weighty, speaking of gravity, weighty subjects in a way that was not threatening or otherwise getting into any kind of arguments about what's real in the afterlife. It's just telling a story about us and how this world maybe brings different things out in us depending on what we're thrown into.
I saw a good movie the other night that really was charming and surprised me called The Half of It. And it takes place in a little town called Squamish, Washington. And it's about like a 17 or 18-year-old Asian girl who is in high school who writes essays, basically pays her fellow students to write essays for them and turn them in. And the teacher even knows that she does it. And basically says, I'd have to read everybody else's crap if I didn't, And so I just admire that you could write about Plato in 6 different ways. But she ends up writing. It's kind of plays the whole Cyrano de Bergerac thing, where the seemingly dumb jock wants her to write a love letter for a girl in school, and he's actually a lot smarter and wiser than he comes across. He's not book smart, but there's a lot of themes about friendship and appreciating differences and what love actually is. And those were, it was funny, and it was well written. I would say that the dialogue is especially fun. So it's a good movie.
No, it's good. And the last tip I'll throw out there, just what we've been watching lately. They have these on HBO Max. They're the Criterion Collection. So they're going to be good, Criterion Collection. And they're actually the official films. They're all about 3 hours long for each Olympics. Okay. And what's most fascinating about them is each country's culture and filmmaking vocabulary informs. We've only watched 3 of them so far. But like the 1964 Tokyo Games has almost like a Hitchcockian. I know that Akira Kurosawa did some noir too, like this noir, like dramatic feeling. But we were watching the 1976 Montreal one, and it was like futuristic, like French. Almost felt like the band Air. I swear that Air like went back in time and did the music for that film, and it's very much technology driven, and also just showed you how much the world changed between 1964 and 1976. It was a whole different world, whole different way of seeing the world and conceiving of yourself. Anyway, that's what we're here to do. We're here to change how you see yourself, conceive of the world, conceive of the football world, always when Matt Waldman and I and everyone here on the couch get together. We appreciate the environment that you create for us, very giving and loving environment for us to just be ourselves. And we appreciate that you get some value out of that. And we'll keep coming back if you do, always, folks, because you're so very classy.